Welcome aboard the dark waters of the Night Crew podcast, where true crime meets the unknown. Each month we dive into the eerie, the unsolved, and the stories that haunt the shadows. If it's creepy, mysterious, or just plain unsettling, you'll find it here. So light your lantern, step onto the deck, and prepare to uncover what lies beneath the surface.
This podcast contains discussions of true crime, disturbing content, and mature themes that may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is strongly advised. The Night Crew podcast aims to present stories with respect to the victims and their families, and the intent is never to sensationalize tragedy, but to shed light on the unknown and unexplained.
Welcome back to episode 34 of The Night Crew. Tonight we'll be discussing Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in Petros, Tennessee. At The Night Crew, each episode we explore the history behind some of the most mysterious and unsettling places, and the stories people still tell about them. From true crime to the unexplained, we look at what happened and what might still be happening. So let's get into it. So Brushy Mountain, I've been there twice. I went a couple years ago and then I went last year again. Not much has changed, but if you're into spooky places, I would definitely visit there. It's really cool to see. But before we get into Brushy Mountain itself, we're going to go into the history behind it all as well. So the origins, Tennessee's Coal War. To understand Brushy Mountain, you have to go back to the late 1800s. After the Civil War, Tennessee used a system called convict leasing. Instead of housing prisoners in state-run facilities, the state leased inmates to private companies. Mining companies loved the system because prisoners provided an extremely cheap labor force. The coal miners who worked in eastern Tennessee hated it. Free miners couldn't compete with companies using prison labor, which drove down wages and threatened jobs. Tensions eventually exploded into a conflict known as the Coal Creek War. Armed miners attacked stockades holding prisoners and released inmates in protest. The conflict became so serious that the Tennessee National Guard was deployed. Public outrage eventually forced Tennessee to end convict leasing, but that created a new problem. What would the state do with thousands of prisoners? The answer was Brushy Mountain. Building a prison in the wilderness. In 1896, Tennessee established Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary in the remote mountains of Morgan County. The location wasn't chosen by accident. The surrounding mountains created a natural fortress. Dense forests, steep terrain, wild animals, and isolation made escape extremely difficult. If an inmate got over the wall, they still had to survive miles and miles of rugged wilderness. Ironically, many of the first prisoners helped construct the prison itself. Inmates mined stone, built roads, laid railroad tracks, and expanded mining operations around the prison. The state had ended convict leasing, but prisoners were still performing dangerous labor, now directly for Tennessee instead of private companies. The coal mines. The prison's existence revolved all around coal. The state operated nearby mines and used inmate labor to extract coal that generated profits. A typical day for prisoners could involve waking before sunrise, descending into the mines, working long shifts underground, and returning exhausted to overcrowded cells. Mining in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was incredibly dangerous. Many inmates died underground. Others developed chronic respiratory illnesses from years of breathing coal dust. For many prisoners, the mines were considered a harsher punishment than imprisonment itself, which is saying something, because America's prisons and jails are not for the weak, that is for sure. Life inside the prison. Early Brushy Mountain was notorious for its harsh conditions. Historical accounts described poor sanitation, disease outbreaks, limited medical care, overcrowded housing, and brutal discipline. Tuberculosis was a particular problem. Before modern antibiotics, tuberculosis spread rapidly in prisons where people lived in close quarters with very poor ventilation. Inmates also suffered from pneumonia, typhoid fever, and other infectious diseases, and punishment could be severe. Prisoners who broke rules might face isolation, loss of privileges, or other punitive measures common to prisons of that era. The philosophy was less about rehabilitation and more about punishment and labor. Expansion through the early 1900s. As Tennessee's prison population grew, Brushy Mountain expanded. New housing units were constructed and additional security measures were added. The prison developed a reputation as Tennessee's toughest institution. Officials often sent the state's most difficult or dangerous inmates there. Its remote location reinforced its image as a place where prisoners disappeared from public view. For many families, visiting was difficult because of the long journey into the mountains, which if you've ever been there, you take many long country curvy roads to get there. It is quite literally in the middle of nowhere. So now we'll go into the Great Depression. During the 1930s, the prison population surged. The economic hardships of the Great Depression contributed to rising incarceration rates. Brushy Mountain became severely overcrowded. Facilities designed for far fewer people housed hundreds more than intended. Overcrowding increased violence, disease transmission, tension between inmates, and strain on prison staff. Despite these problems, the prison continued operating much as it had for decades. A prison for Tennessee's most notorious criminals. I'm sorry in advance if you hear my dog in the background. She's upset. My fiance just left. Anyways, by the mid-1900s, Brushy Mountain had become synonymous with high security incarceration. The prison housed murderers, organized criminals, escape risks, and inmates considered too dangerous for other facilities. Its reputation spread across the state. Many people who lived in Tennessee viewed Brushy Mountain as a prison you never wanted to be sent to. The combination of isolation, security, and harsh conditions made it legendary. So one of the infamous inmates was James Earl Ray. This is an inmate most people associate with Brushy Mountain. Ray was convicted for the 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and was sent to Brushy Mountain in 1970. Because of who he was one of the most famous prisoners in America. Guards knew his face. Reporters followed every development involving him. The escape. On June 10th, 1977, Ray and 6 other inmates executed one of the most famous escapes in Tennessee history. Using a homemade ladder, they scaled the prison wall and disappeared into the mountains. For nearly 2 days, the country watched the search unfold. Authorities deployed bloodhounds, helicopters, and hundreds of officers. The rugged terrain around Brushy Mountain made the search difficult, but it also made survival difficult for the escapees. Ray was eventually captured roughly 55 hours later, a few miles from the prison. The stabbing. In 1981, another inmate attacked Ray and stabbed him more than 20 times, and somehow he survived the assault. But it highlighted the violence that existed within the prison walls. Paul Dennis Reed is another one. Reed became one of Tennessee's most infamous serial killers. During a series of robberies in the late 1990s, he murdered 7 people at restaurants around Nashville. The crime shocked Tennessee because the victims appeared to be chosen largely as witnesses rather than personal targets. Reed spent time within Tennessee's prison system before later transfers when they shut down. He was known for bizarre behavior and claims regarding his mental health. His notoriety followed him throughout incarceration because he was already considered one of the state's most dangerous killers. Byron Looper. Looper's story feels almost like a movie plot. He was a Tennessee politician who murdered political rival Tommy Burks in 1998. Authorities believe the killing was politically motivated. The idea that an elected official would assassinate a political opponent stunned the state. After conviction, Looper spent part of his sentence at Brushy Mountain. His case brought another layer of notoriety to a prison. I keep saying prison wrong, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. To a prison already known for housing infamous criminals. And then we have the escape artist in the story. One of the most interesting aspects of Brushy Mountain isn't a single inmate. It is the culture of escape attempts. Because the prison sat in such a remote area, escaping the walls was only the first challenge. Many inmates discovered that surviving the mountains was just as difficult. Stories emerged over the decades of prisoners hiding in forests, following railroad tracks, stealing supplies, and being captured after days or weeks on the run. The prison became known as a place where inmates constantly tested security. Every successful escape attempt became part of prison folklore. The forgotten inmates. Nobody seems to know the exact number of deaths at Brushy Mountain. The prison operated from 1896 to 2009, and records from the early decades are incomplete. Historians in the prison's own historical materials describe death as a constant part of life there, but they do not provide a verified total. While famous criminals get remembered, thousands of inmates who lived and died at Brushy Mountain have largely been forgotten. These people included coal miners working prison labor details. This was likely one of the biggest killers during Brushy's early decades. Prisoners spent long hours underground in dangerous mines where they faced, again, cave-ins, falling rock, equipment accidents, explosions, and methane gas hazards. The prison's own historical account specifically mentions deadly mining accidents as a regular part of life at Brushy. Convicts continue to work and die in the mines for decades. And then you have the men who died from disease, as mentioned earlier. So I mentioned, there was typhoid fever, there was pneumonia, tuberculosis was a big one, and also syphilis. The combination of the overcrowding, not enough room, poor sanitation, hard labor, and limited medical care created conditions where illnesses spread very quickly. Many inmates died from disease rather than violence. But there were also the victims of prison violence. Deaths occurred from stabbings, assaults, gang violence, and prison riots. One documented example occurred in 1982 when inmates took guards hostage, seized their weapons, and murdered 2 fellow prisoners during a radically motivated attack. The prison's paranormal tour materials also reference inmates being killed by fellow prisoners using impoverished weapons and other violent means. And then, again, we have the really harsh punishment and beatings that the prisoners faced. According to Brushy's historical records, inmates were routinely beaten for failing to meet production quotas in the mines, even when they were already sick. The prison history notes that many prisoners died as a result of these conditions and punishments. And you also had inmates who died of natural causes. So many of them passed away from old age, heart disease, chronic illness, and respiratory problems from years of mining. Especially in the later decades of the prison's operation, natural causes became a much larger percentage of deaths. And then also, there were the inmates who spent years in isolation and prisoners whose names rarely appeared in historical records. And I added this section, solitary confinement, because when you go in, aka the hole in the prison, you can feel such negative energy down there. It is pitch black dark if you close the doors. It's a scary place to be, so I figured I'd add it to the podcast because it definitely gives you a picture of how this place worked and how it was. So at Brushy Mountain, the hole refers to the prison's punitive isolation area used for inmates who violated rules, were considered dangerous, or just needed to be separated from the general population. Inmates placed in the hole were kept in small, enclosed cells with minimal stimulation. Conditions varied over time, but the purpose remained consistent: complete separation from other prisoners in very strict restriction of activity. Prisoners in isolation typically experienced extended periods alone in a cell, limited or no contact with other inmates, restricted access to reading materials or personal items. Meals were delivered through a very small slot in the door. There were controlled or limited lighting depending on the cell and the era, and very little opportunity for movement outside the cell. Time in isolation can last from days to weeks, and in some cases longer, depending on penal decisions. The environment of the hole was designed to be quiet and restrictive, removing most forms of stimulation and communication from the outside world. And now, my favorite part, the haunting of Brushy Mountain. Now, I have not investigated there yet. It is very expensive, to get a group to go there and to pay to have the whole night to do what you want. It's on my bucket list, though. I will get there one day. So, why do people believe it is haunted? Brushy Mountain is considered one of Tennessee's most active paranormal locations for 3 main reasons. Extreme isolation, since it's deep in the mountains. There's a long history of death and suffering, and old buildings that were never fully modernized or replaced. Even skeptics admit the environment itself feels heavy because you're walking through intact prison structures where thousands of people have lived and died. D Block, the center of activity. This is the most famous haunted section. D Block was a high-security housing unit, but it was also built on top of earlier prison structures, including areas associated with inmate deaths in the so-called Death House legend. Reported experiences. Visitors and investigators often report shadow figures standing in cell doorways, sudden drops in temperature, feeling of being watched intensely, whispering voices when no one is present, and doors slamming or locking on their own. Some people describe it as the emotional heaviest area of the prison. A common claim from paranormal teams is that D Block feels like it has many layers of presence, as if different eras of inmates overlap there. Then we have the cell blocks. These are long corridors lined with steel doors, and they amplify sound in eerie ways. Some activity reported is metal clanging with no source, footsteps pacing behind visitors, disembodied yelling or coughing, and cell doors moving slightly without explanation. A lot of investigators point out that sound travels unpredictably in the building, which can create natural echoes. But people still report experiences that don't match simple acoustics. The mine areas. Because Brushy operated coal mines using inmate labor, a lot of the folklore centers around the tunnels and mining spaces. Even though most of the original mine infrastructure is no longer accessible in the same way, stories persist of pickaxe sounds underground, flickering lights in dark areas, voices calling out from below ground, or sensations of pressure or suffocation. This is where the history of mining deaths and accidents gets tied directly into paranormal interpretation. And when you go to Brushy Mountain, you cannot tour the mines. I don't know if they shut them down, I'm assuming, and they don't want visitors going there. But I think it'd be really cool if they opened them back up one day just so that you could see the entrance where the prisoners went in and out. So another common area for paranormal experiences would be the dining hall and common areas. Less dramatic visually, but commonly reported as emotionally intense. Visitors describe sudden feelings of anxiety or dread, the sensation of being surrounded by people, cold spots in open areas, and brief glimpses of movement and peripheral vision. Some investigators believe these areas may have had high emotional activity due to crowding, conflict, and stress over decades. And then we have the shadow figures and inmate presences. Across multiple areas of the prison, one of the most consistent claims is shadow figures resembling inmates walking the halls. These are often described as human-shaped but without clear facial features, People say they wear old-style prison clothing, and they appear briefly, and then they just vanish into thin air. Some witnesses believe these are residual replays of past activity rather than interactive spirits. And then you have the skeptical view. Possible explanations include echoes and sound distortion in the large concrete buildings. You have low light conditions causing people to see shapes and shadows when moving through old structures, which can create more noise. The psychological expectation, people expect something to happen because it's so haunted, and suggestibility during paranormal tours. A lot of activity can be explained by environment, but not all reports fit neatly into that. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, Brushy Mountain is a place where human suffering was constant for over a century. Even if nothing remains after death, the buildings still hold the physical record of everything that happened inside them. By the time Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary closed in 2009, it had been in operation for more than a century. What remained was a facility that had outlived most of the systems it was built to serve. The coal mines that once defined its purpose were gone. The overcrowding and outdated infrastructure had become unsustainable. The prison had shifted over time from an industrial labor institution into a modern maximum security facility that no longer fit its original design. When the prison finally shut down, inmates were transferred to other facilities across Tennessee. The gates closed, the cells emptied, and the property was left largely silent for the first time in generations. What remained behind were the physical traces of its history: cell blocks, guard towers, medical areas, isolation units, and industrial spaces that had been used continuously since the late 1800s. Today, the site stands as a preserved piece of correctional history where visitors can walk through the same corridors that once held thousands of inmates over more than a century of operation. The stories tied to Brushy Mountain of labor, punishment, violence, survival, and isolation remain part of its legacy long after its closure. That brings us to the end of today's story on Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary. Thank you all again for listening and supporting our podcast. You can follow us on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook at The Night Crew. With that being said, I'll let you go for now until next time. Just remember, some places don't stay in the past.